All right, so what I've got here is I'm going to do a little tutorial on mounting a scope. This is a Sauer Atacama. It's in 6.5 Creedmoor, but that really doesn't matter. I'm going to be mounting this DNZ mount on there, and then I'm going to put a Vortex scope on it, but I kind of just wanted to go through a couple of tips on this that should help you. The first thing when you're mounting these scopes and stuff, I've literally done hundreds of these through the years. I used to do them for everybody and their brother. Keep one thing in mind. Loctite your bases, not the rings. Make sure when you're doing this that you get the proper mount ahead of time. I know that sounds kind of trivial, but for instance, this Sauer 100, this is a 30 millimeter mount. I think it's low right off the top of my head. But Sauer only fits a Remington 700 long action. So even though this is a short action rifle in 6.5, you have to get the long action mount. So make sure you look either online or on your actual specification for your rifle. Make sure you look and see what mount that takes before you buy it. So anyway, because I know I bought the short action Remington 700 and it didn't fit. So I've had that happen a million times too. I've got some red Loctite here. You can use blue. I've used both. Anyway, what I always like to do on this is I like to go ahead and find this rear base screw, and I'll put it in just until it's pretty snug. And then I'll go do the front one. A little more Loctite. I don't put a ton on these, but you do want your bases to stay good and solid the whole time. And again, don't Loctite those rings. Rings tend to pinch, and then you need to get them loose at some point. Okay, so then at that point, you're pretty much good to put whichever one of these two screws that are left that you want. This, they usually have 4, so always do one end and the other end. If you're gonna figure out that one of them doesn't fit, you wanna do that pretty quick, and that comes from doing that by doing one and the other. That's where you usually tell. Sometimes these mounts are close, and you look at that thing and you're like, oh man, what the heck's wrong? You knew because you put one back screw in and you went to the other back screw. Usually your inside screws aren't the ones that miss. It's these two outside ones. So by doing those two first, you know that you've got the right mount. A little more Loctite here. Now, I've got a torque wrench. I'm not using it on this because I've done so many of these. I kind of know what kind of pressure I want on these. I think most of them, if I remember correctly from the factory goodies, always want these to be somewhere around 20 to 25 pounds. You can use a torque wrench for that. I've got one, matter of fact, I got one sitting right there. What I should do is check this, see how close I am. Let me just do that and we'll see. We'll see if I know what I'm talking about. So I'll get out the torque wrench here, and I'll set the torque wrench to, shoot, I don't see all that well. I'll set the torque wrench to 25 pounds. And let me just see how close I hit it. I'm gonna assume these are 25. There you go. Take my little bit out here and let's just see how many I've got. Spot on, baby. All right, so we proved that. I'll go ahead and untorque my wrench. If you have one of these fat wrenches, these are great for scopes, great for mounts, great for a lot of things. Take that pressure back off of that when you're done. I think it's just better if you're going to store that for very long to take the pressure back off of that. Now, I like to go in here and kind of wipe this up a little bit. I've got a little extra Loctite on there. So I've got my scope. This is where a lot of personal preference comes in. That's a low mount and it still sets pretty low. Now before I do this, here's the big tip of the day. When you've got this base locked onto here like you want it, come back here and check this bolt. You don't see this so much anymore, but in the past, when these screws wouldn't get machined right, it was really common, like in the 90s and early 2000s when I was setting up a lot of them, it was really common to thread these bolts down in there, get them nice and seated, mount your scope, go back and your bolt wouldn't open because these bolts drove through the top of your receiver. Doesn't happen too much anymore, but go ahead and check that just to make sure. Of course, make sure your own safety and all that, and you always want to check it to make sure it's empty before you do anything. Now I'm going to set this scope in there, and I want to just visually look at it and make sure nothing's hitting on anything. Typically where they'll hit right here on this front mount. Right where this bevel comes down, it'll hit this front mount. That's bad. You'll never get really good accuracy when you lock that down and you pinch the bevel in the end of that. This one looks like we've got a lot of clearance. So on these one-piece mounts, which I really like, by the way, it makes it a whole lot easier to get these scopes sighted in than with the two-piece mount. I have some play forward and backward, so you can slide your scope a little forward, a little backward, just see where it hits. Now all the way back, it's pretty close to hitting, but it's not hitting there. But what'll happen is if I slide it forward, my adjustment, my magnification adjustment hits the front of this base. So I don't want that. So this scope's gonna have to be mounted back a little ways off of that. Next step, I'll take this top ring and I'm only gonna start the two screws in that. I'm not going to tighten these screws down because I've got to then level this scope up. But I want it to be roughly held in place while I'm doing that. So I'm going to drop these down through. Again, no Loctite on these. And I'm not threading them tight. I just want them to get a good start in there where they'll hold. Now keep in mind, it's very common when you're doing this to start tightening up the threads on your rings and your scope turn, especially if one of those rings is hitting in an area where it's not evenly hitting across the surface of the scope. So if you have a pinch point on this scope, as you tighten down this ring, it grabs the top of that and it'll want to turn that on you. So just keep that in mind. You may have to loosen these rings multiple times and then tighten them back up, kind of overcorrect your scope slightly, then loosen it back up, or then tighten it, it'll bring it back around. So the next thing I want to do now is I want to kind of set the eye relief on this. To do that, I'm going to close my eyes and I'm going to put this scope or put this rifle where it feels comfortable, and then I'm going to open my eye and see if I can see through the whole scope. If you have black top or black at the bottom, your eye relief's not right. Closed eyes, face on the stock where you would be, open your eyes. Now this one's a little bit off, but okay, now do the whole thing again and make sure it's still right. Eyes closed, rifle mounted, eyes open. And you'll start to see shadows. Now just try it. Pull your head back and forth a little bit. You'll start to see the shadows in it. That tell you that you've got it right. One more time. Deep breath. Mount the rifle. Eyes closed. Open the eyes. Don't see any black. So that's where I want it. Now here's where the hard part comes in. And I have mounted hundreds of these, like I said earlier, and people will come back to me and say, that scope's cockeyed. Well, twisted is what I mean, cockeyed. I can put a level on this, and I can level this thing up to where, for me, it looks totally level. And you can look through it and say, oh man, that's not level anymore. That's not level for me. Everybody looks through a rifle differently, and everybody's face hits this stock differently. Why this matters is when you're downrange, if you're off slightly, your bullet carries differently and your bullet impacts differently. At 100 yards, you're probably never going to notice it. Probably at 200, you would never notice it. When you start getting to 300, 400, 500, 600, 700 yards, that plays a big deal in it. So you want to know that your rifle's nice and level, or your scope is nice and level with your rifle. The problem that's come in here is that, for instance, if you have one of these levels, this is a Wheeler level. What's happened is most of these rifles used to have nice flat areas on the rifle that you could level this with. So this has got a little magnet. You'd set it on that flat place. You put the other level on the top. You'd get them matching. You tighten her down. You'd be good to go. Now, what's happened through the years is that a lot of these rifles have went away from having flat surfaces. For instance, this Sauer 100 has no flat area on this receiver. Even the back, which looks relatively flat, has a slight round shape to it, and you can tell that by the base when you're looking at the bottom of the base. So what you've got is your base is flat, but this thing's pretty thick, so I don't know if this thing goes in there or not. Nope, it won't go in there. So you need to try and find a flat area on your gun if you can, or if you can't, you can get one of the ones that fits in the end of the barrel. Again, you kind of got to have something to level off of. Everything's level off of something, but you got to level it. So you put that in the end. Oh, well, it's level. Well, it's level with what? I mean, you could turn it around and turn the gun back around to where the gun's like this and the level straight up, and it's level. So you need to find a nice flat surface. So what I want to do is I want to get this top one pretty much in bubble. Once that's in bubble, I know where that's at. So I know that my scope is now sitting on these mounts level. That's not necessarily level with the rifle, because the rifle could be off slightly. So what I have to do is I have to find me a nice level spot, and that could be opening this bolt. That's pretty level right there. Pretty level's not close enough to being level's the problem. So let me see here. If I turn this scope slightly, now I'm roughly right where I need to be level on both. Now you give it the eye test. There are plenty of times you'll look through this thing and it's level with something, but not necessarily with your stock. What you want to see is that horizontal line, the vertical line, horizontal being flat, the vertical line needs to be vertical with your stock and with your barrel. So without touching anything, and you can get all the way back, come all the way back here, that's slightly off, I can tell you. I can see through the plane of this. The thing about it is you don't have to be right up on a scope to see through it. So pull your head back, get a longer reference, and get it with the stock. It's awfully dang close, boy. Both of my levels are level. It's pretty close. Now, somewhere I've got a wrench. Here we go. I'm going to slowly start to turn these while trying not to affect where this rifle's at. I don't want to mess up my levels. I just want to slowly start torquing down these screws, a little at a time, just until they kind of start to catch. Then I'll come over here and I'll do these two. And then I'll do this one. Just until they catch. And then I'm going to check and make sure that's where I want it still. So they're both still good and level. I get that nice long reference point. I make sure that's still level. I give them the final tightening, which I'll check here with the torque wrench just to make sure that's usually, again, somewhere between 20 and 25 pounds. I just want to snug these up where the scope's not going to move. And then I'm going to check it again. Everything's still level. Take the levels off. My bolt still works fine. I'll finish tightening that down, and I know that I've got this where I want it. I'll give it a final check. Eyes closed. Mount the rifle. Eyes open. Oh yeah, sweet spot. Now I'll do a bore sight, and I'll talk to you about that in a different video here in just a minute. But that's got that scope mounted up. Again, I'll finish snugging these up. I don't have to tighten these super tight, because that pinches that scope. So I don't want these to be super tight, but everything's good and level, and it's on there solid right now.